Roger, liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, there, problem.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the April 15, 2020 edition of Space News. This is Peter Auld, and tonight I'm joined by Tina Stagg, Michael Abdullah and Angela De Grazia, and we're all from the Space Association of Australia. So let's get started with some more Australian space news. Australian startup Myrota has raised $19.3 million to build out a satellite constellation for Internet of Things services. Australian investors Host Plus and Main Sequence Ventures led Myrota's Series B round with participation from several other investors including Boeing, Horizon X and In-Q-Tel. The company has 3 CubeSats under construction and recently announced it was buying 4 small satellites along with spectrum licenses and ground stations from Canadian ship tracking company Exact Earth. Myrota plans to ultimately have a constellation of at least 25 satellites to provide connectivity for Internet of Things devices. The low Earth orbit constellation company SAS Global has filed for bankruptcy protection in Australia. The company, which is traded on the Australian Stock Exchange, said it entered voluntary administration. The company had raised $29.1 million and was seeking to raise $14.2 million more to deploy an initial constellation of 8 small sats to provide communication services. Over to New Zealand, Rocket Lab has demonstrated a key part of its plan to recover and reuse its Electron rocket. In a test early last month, one helicopter released a replica Electron first stage which deployed a parachute. A second helicopter then grabbed the parachute with a hook, demonstrating the ability for mid-air capture of falling rocket stages. The company has already shown that those first stages can make it back to the surface intact, and on a future launch will demonstrate the ability to recover the stage for potential reuse. Electron launches are currently on hold because of the coronavirus pandemic, but the company expects to be able to resume launches from New Zealand shortly after the government lifts a nationwide lockdown. And over to Tina.
Thanks, Pete, and good evening, space fans. In International Space Station news, a Soyuz spacecraft successfully deployed a crew of 3 to the International Space Station last week. On board the Soyuz MS-16 spacecraft were Russian cosmonauts Anatoly Ivanishin and Ivan Wagner and American astronaut Chris Cassidy. As reported previously by Space News, pre-launch preparations for this mission were unusual given the addition of Ivanishin and Wagner to the crew in February, replacing Nikolai Tikhonov and Andrei Babkin because of a medical issue and the ongoing coronavirus pandemic that greatly reduced the number of people at the launch site. A report by an independent panel sharply criticised the management of the station's US National Lab. The report found fundamental issues with how the ISS National Lab was set up and how the Centre for the Advancement of Science in Space, or CASIS, the non-profit organisation contracted by NASA to manage the ISS National Lab, was operated. That included a CASIS board member compensated much more than usual for a small non-profit, as well as NASA managing its work with CASIS at several levels rather than through a single point of contact. NASA and CASIS said they would implement a number of the report's recommendations, including changing how the CASIS board operates and establishing a single NASA program executive to serve as the liaison to CASIS. To US space policy, and the White House is looking to build up international support for its approach to the use of space resources. An executive order signed last week by President Donald Trump directed the State Department to lead interagency efforts to encourage other countries to adopt the American position supporting safe and sustainable operations for the public and private recovery and use of space resources. The order reiterates the long-stated opposition to the 1979 Moon Agreement, which would set up an international regime for overseeing use of space resources, but which only a handful of nations have adopted. A senior administration official said the executive order had been in development since last year, but was published now after NASA released its report outlining its long-term lunar exploration plans that envision the use of lunar water ice and other resources. The official also said the administration's approach would have been discussed at meetings of the UN's Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, but those meetings were cancelled or postponed by the coronavirus pandemic. And to NASA's commercial resupply services, and the final first-generation SpaceX Dragon cargo spacecraft returned to Earth last week. The spacecraft splashed down in the Pacific Ocean southwest of Long Beach, California, wrapping up the CRS-20 cargo mission. As reported in last week's Space News, the mission was the last for the original version of the cargo Dragon spacecraft, with SpaceX using a variant of its new Crew Dragon spacecraft for future cargo missions. And over to Mike.
Thank you, Tina, and let's turn to NASA's Commercial Crew program. Next month's SpaceX Commercial Crew test flight could stay at the International Space Station for 2 to 3 months. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said the Demo 2 mission, with NASA astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley on board, would probably stay at the station for an extended period to provide additional crew for the station, which will have only 3 people on board at the time. The mission is scheduled for a launch in the latter half of May, pending resolution of an investigation into an engine shutdown in a Falcon 9 launch last month and completion of Crew Dragon parachute tests. The mission would be followed in August by the first operational Crew Dragon mission, or Crew 1, with 4 NASA and 1 JAXA astronauts on board. Meanwhile, crews recently tested an escape system at the pad that will host Crew Dragon launches. The emergency egress drill involved NASA and SpaceX crews simulating an emergency on the gantry at Launch Complex 39A that required them to quickly evacuate the structure. The drill involved boarding baskets that then sped down wires to the ground, then getting into an armoured vehicle. The sidewire basket system dates back to the shuttle program and was refurbished for use on Crew Dragon launches. And staying with the Commercial Crew program, Boeing will perform a second uncrewed test flight of its CST-100 Starliner commercial crew spacecraft. The company said it would effectively refly the Orbital Flight Test, or OFT-1 mission, to demonstrate the quality of the Starliner system. The first uncrewed test flight in December suffered problems that shortened the mission and prevented the spacecraft from docking with the International Space Station. NASA said last month an independent review identified 61 corrective actions for the company, but the agency said then it had not decided if Boeing would need to redo the test flight before it would allow astronauts on Starliner. A date for the second OFT mission hasn't been set yet, but Boeing said it would probably be this northern autumn. And turning to NASA's Moon program. A NASA report has outlined the agency's approach to long-term lunar exploration. The 13-page report explained how NASA proposes to develop a sustainable approach to human lunar exploration after its planned return to the Moon on the Artemis 3 mission in 2024. The concept calls for the creation of an Artemis base camp at the south pole of the Moon, including the development of unpressurized and pressurized rovers, as well as a surface habitat. The Gateway, which NASA officials have said will not be on the critical path for Artemis 3, will, however, play a key role in those long-term exploration plans, including preparations for human missions to Mars. The report offered few details about the cost and schedule. Meanwhile, NASA has selected Masten Space Systems to deliver a set of payloads to the south pole of the Moon on a commercial lunar lander. Masten's XL-1 lander will carry the 9 science and technology demonstration payloads to the Moon in late 2022 for NASA under a $75.9 million contract that is part of NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services program. Masten plans to sell additional space on the lander for other government and commercial customers to fund the overall mission. And over to you, Angelo.
Well, thanks, Mike. Moving to Europe. The European Space Agency is resuming operations of 4 space science missions placed on hold because of the coronavirus pandemic. ESA announced that the cluster ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter, Mars Express and Solar Orbiter missions would resume operations after being placed in a safe mode on March 24. ESA said one employee at the Mission Control Centre in Germany tested positive for the COVID-19 and, as a precaution, about 20 other employees who had been in contact with that person were asked to self-quarantine. Those people had primarily been working on those 4 missions, which led to the decision to suspend operations. None of those employees showed symptoms of the disease, and the person who was diagnosed with COVID-19 is recovering. Over to Russia. Russian officials aren't pleased with the new White House executive order about space resources rights. The order directed the State Department to seek international support for the US position that companies and governments have the right to extract space resources. Roscosmos argued that the United States was seeking to make claims on celestial bodies. Attempts to expropriate outer space and aggressive plans to actually seize territories of other planets hardly set the countries on course for fruitful cooperation, Roscosmos said. To China. A Chinese rocket launch of an Indonesian satellite failed last week. A Long March 3B rocket lifted off from the Xichang Satellite Launch Center carrying the Nusantara 2 communications satellite. The launch initially appeared to go as expected, but the rocket's third stage malfunctioned. The upper stage and its payload was seen re-entering over Guam. The launch is the second failure of a Chinese rocket in as many months and may delay future launches. Over to India. Training of Indian astronaut candidates in Russia has been affected by the coronavirus pandemic. Russian space company Glavkosmos, which arranged the training for the 4 Indian pilots at the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Centre, said the centre was in lockdown, requiring them to remain at the centre until the end of the month. Glavkosmos said the astronaut candidates were healthy and had been training and exercising on their own during the lockdown. Back to America and SpaceX. SpaceX is preparing for another Starlink launch this week. The Falcon 9 launch is scheduled for no earlier than April 16, carrying a 7th set of 60 Starlink satellites. The launch is proceeding despite restrictions imposed by the coronavirus pandemic that led some other Falcon 9 customers to delay their launches. Okay, it's back to Pete.
Thanks, Angelo. And finally tonight, a pioneering female astronomer whose research showed how stars formed heavier elements has died. Margaret Burbridge died last week at the age of 100. Burbridge, along with her physicist husband Geoffrey Burbridge, physicist William Fowler and astronomer Fred Hoyle, published a 1957 paper that explained how most heavier elements were formed by thermonuclear reactions in stars. The paper is one of the most famous in modern astrophysics. Burbidge was also the first woman to serve as director of the Royal Observatory in England and was the first female president of the American Astronomical Society. And that's it for Space News this week. Thank you, everyone, and we'll speak to you again next week. Bye now.